Good morning, everyone. I realised on my way here that I've understood the title of the talk for the first time in the car on the way here. What I'm actually going to talk about is the move to DLOs and how you can reduce VAT on repairs. I'm not going to talk about the case for VAT reduction on repairs because that's a political issue, and as we know, predicting anything in politics is a little bit fraught at the moment. I think those who predicted the different outcome of the Scottish referendum, or even the correct outcome, were a little bit surprised by how close it was, or perhaps wasn't. So I'm not going to talk about the case for VAT reduction on repairs. I'm going to talk very practically about how you can do it if you want to. So what am I going to cover? I'm going to look at the drivers, both commercial and legal, for moving repairs into a DLO. I do like the term DLO rather than in-house maintenance team. I think the terminology is accurate, precise. It says what it does on the tin. And actually, I know of a number of very good DLOs. So DLO has this sort of reputation of old local authority, perhaps not too efficient, knocking off at about lunchtime. Not the case. DLO is a technical term, and it's a little bit quicker to say than in-house maintenance team. We're going to dip into VAT. You've probably done some physics and chemistry earlier. This is your maths lesson. So we're going to have to do a little bit of fairly heavyweight maths to understand why the VAT advantages are there for DLOs. I'm then going to look at the DIY option, doing it yourself in terms of running your maintenance service, and a bit of case law next. TECAL, this is the case about exemptions from tendering within group structures and what that means. I'm then going to look at a few alternatives to DLOs, which I call doing DIY with others, focusing on cost-sharing groups, which are between registered providers, and I'm going to look at what is a wholly owned subsidiary and how you can have a contractor involved in helping you run your DLO. So what are the drivers? Well, the first driver is obviously this saving of 20% on labour costs. It's not 20% on materials, it's not 20% on VAT overall, it's just on labour costs. But that's not the only factor that people are considering, and there are ways of saving VAT without setting up your own DLO through some of the other models that are around. It's well known that construction prices are increasing. More work means less competition and higher prices. I would say possibly fairer prices, because we know that some of the contracts that were tendered 2 or 3 years ago were tendered at extremely low prices and possibly unsustainable prices. Contractors that have downsized during the recession are struggling to recruit qualified people. So we've had the same problem within our own profession. I've been struggling to get a well-qualified, newly qualified solicitor for about 2 years for my team. We've grown our own. We've kept on one of our trainees who's extremely good. But that problem with the recession and people not taking on trainees at the right time means that construction prices are bound to increase. And we've seen certainly a return of the claims culture. We've probably had more payment disputes in the last 2 years than we had in the previous 10. So some of that, I think, is a reflection of the prices that were tendered a couple of years ago, but we're certainly seeing a lot of dispute work. So how is your contractor doing? There is, of course, the insolvency risk. It's still there with Connaught, Kinetics and Rock. I think those insolvencies did lead to a number of people bringing services in-house at that time. I advised a number of people who effectively took a 2p transfer of the staff from one of these contractors and used that as the driver to bring the work in-house. There's consolidation in the sector. We've seen Morrison and Mears taking over Morrison. We've heard the recent announcement of the merger between Bullock and United House. And the new EU procurement directive is going to create risk for you. The new regulations came out last week. I haven't had a chance to get on top of them, but the way that they are being implemented is effectively to copy out, to write out the new EU directive. And what that directive says is you can't have a minimum turnover threshold than twice your annual value of the contract. And it's going to be much harder for you to carry out detailed financial investigations into your contractors. There's certainly some guidance, it's not the status of law, but it's guidance that suggests that credit reference checks are not lawful in an EU procurement. I wouldn't go that far, but I think you do need to be very careful how you use them. So there are some commercial drivers for bringing things in-house which are nothing to do with saving VAT on repairs, and they're quite powerful drivers. But I'm not going to say any more about those commercial drivers because you can probably work them out for yourself. I'm going to go straight into the VAT and legal consequences. I have an engineer working in my team, and the first thing that he says whenever he meets anyone is, I am not a solicitor. So he gets his disclaimer in first. I need to get my disclaimer in. I'm not a VAT specialist, but I do have an understanding of how it works. There are different VAT positions at different housing providers. Local authorities and ALMOs effectively get their VAT back. So there is no advantage for them in VAT terms in setting up their own in-house maintenance operation. The other commercial drivers might apply, but there's no VAT saving for local authorities or ALMOs. I don't know if there's anyone here from an ALMO. I know there are no local authorities, but please stay with us. You might learn some things of relevance to you, although quite a lot of what I say won't be directly relevant. So, registered providers. How does VAT work? VAT is charged on the supply of services, and services for VAT purposes, not for procurement purposes, which is confusing, includes construction services, so repairs and maintenance services. So, if you buy something from a supplier, you pay the supplier £100 for, say, a piece of kit, and the supplier will charge you £20 VAT on top of this. This is a normal organisation, if I can call it that. It's not a registered provider. So, Anthony Collins solicitors, for example, if we buy a new piece of computer equipment for £100, we will pay £20 to the supplier on top of that. We will do some work for someone, and using that computer, and we will charge them £250 fixed fee, and we will have to charge them VAT of £50 on top of that. So we have charged £50 in VAT, we've paid £20 in VAT, and we have to give the rest to the government in the form of HM revenue and customs. So that's how it works for a normal business. But registered providers are in a slightly different situation. They have what's called partial exemption status. And it all comes from the fact that part of their supplies, the services they supply, are supplies to tenants. And rent, as you know, is exempt from VAT. You don't have to pay VAT on rent other than in exceptional circumstances where you have commercial buildings. So because rent is exempt, you can only recover a proportion of your input VAT. So let's put some figures on that. We've got the same payment to the supplier of £100 with £20 VAT on it. That £100 is used to supply some services, perhaps for your residents and perhaps to another registered provider or a commercial organisation. So you've got some third-party trading plus your services provided to your tenants. So if we keep the maths simple and say that £150 of that represents rent and £50 represents services provided to someone else, you'll charge VAT on the services you provide to someone else. So they'll pay £60 including VAT, but your tenants will still pay £150. So therefore, only 1/4 of your input VAT is attributable to the services you make. So you can only recover £5, a quarter of your £20 VAT that you've paid. It gets worse. You've received £10 VAT, you've paid £20 VAT, but you can only attribute £5 of that. So the difference between the £10 you receive and the £5 that you treated as having paid goes to the government. So you are effectively leaking VAT, and that's what will happen if you treat your supplier as your maintenance contractor. That's what happens in a normal maintenance contract scenario. The other piece of maths we need to understand is actually the test about VAT grouping. VAT grouping is where you have organisations within a group structure. So you have, for example, a DLO, which is in a separate organisation providing services to one or more registered providers within the same group. If you can satisfy the control test, in other words, an organisation has control over the DLO and the registered providers, or the registered provider has control over the DLO, then you can VAT group the organisations. That means that transactions between them are invisible for VAT purposes. They're treated as a single organisation, so there's big ring round the VAT group. And supplies between them are not VATable. So you don't have this problem of your DLO charging you VAT which you can't recover. I mean, there are tricks around that with new build where you can set up a VAT subsidiary and get that back on professional fees, and we've done quite a few of those, but that's a little bit outside the scope of what we're talking about here. So, the implications of having a DLO. When the pink bus went around the country on the TSA conversation, tenants identified repairs and maintenance as their #1 priority. In business commercial terms, you don't normally outsource your core business, and therefore philosophically there is a logic to retaining your most important business within the association. In other words, recognising that repairs and maintenance is the thing that most drives customer satisfaction in your organisation and the thing that you want greatest control over. So when you're in competition with your development teams, make sure that your board realises the importance of repairs and maintenance and doesn't focus solely on the numbers of properties, because this is the thing that drives the success of your organisation. So in philosophical terms, there's a logic to keeping it in-house. If you do that, you carry, of course, the full delivery of risk, including responsibility for health and safety. There's no one to blame if you get it wrong. If you have an external contractor, some of the flak will still come to you. That's inevitable. That's part of the territory we're in. But at least there's someone to share that flak with you. If you're running a DLO, though, you need to make sure that it's run well, and that has governance implications. It has implications for the staff who are managing the DLO, but it also has implications for the board. If your DLO is part of the provider itself, then your main board will be responsible for that, and the board members need to be equipped to discharge that responsibility. That's particularly the case if you have councillors or tenants on the board, if you're an LSVT, for example. There needs to be sufficient skilling of your board to understand the issues that you're facing as an organisation in running a DLO. You can, of course, put the DLO into a separate organisation and give it its own board with specialist skills and specialist people on that board. But remember that the main board still has some oversight of that. One of the advantages of running a DLO is you do have control over the recruitment of your workforce. And I use the term local labour here deliberately. If you have an external contract with a maintenance contractor, there's lots you can do in terms of requiring apprenticeships, requiring training places, work placements, but you can't specify that they must be local because that's actually a breach of the EU treaty. Now, it's very rare for this to be challenged, but it is actually a breach. So it's an area you need to be careful about. When you're recruiting, you can choose where you place your adverts. You can choose how you communicate your vacancies, so you can make it local. You can't stop someone from outside the area from applying, but you can make it a lot harder for them. You do, of course, have to comply with the equality laws. So if you have two candidates and the better one comes from outside your area, you can't give an area preference in terms of locality, but you can equalize the disadvantages in some ways. This is, of course, subject to TUPE, and I'll come on to TUPE when we look at implementation issues. But again, all employment risks are retained and pensions risks. So if you have a workforce that's particularly come from a local authority, then and they're in the local government pension scheme, then there are costs associated with employing those staff. So, if you set up a DLO, what are the issues? The first question to ask is, where is your DLO going to sit? Is it going to sit as part of the main provider, or is it going to sit in a subsidiary? If it sits in a subsidiary, can you avoid tendering the contract? Do you have to tender your contract with your DLO? Are there ways around that? And that's where the TECAL test comes in. And there are equal pay issues. Your registered provider and any subsidiary will be what's called associated employers. So for the purposes of equal pay, a comparator in the other organisation can be picked. So you need to be aware that pay and conditions across your group need to be fair. And VAT grouping, we've already mentioned that, making sure that the control test is satisfied. The next question is whether your DLO will just work for you, will just work for organisations within your group, or will work for third parties. Two issues here. If your DLO is part of the main association, the test is, does that third-party work create a risk to social housing? In other words, can you be satisfied that your own repairs are going to get done, that your DLO is not going to incur a loss on an external contract that's actually going to prejudice the viability of the organisation or its social housing? If your DLO is in a subsidiary, third-party work has to be limited to currently 10%, soon to be 20% of its turnover. I'll come on to that in a moment. You'll probably need to get some external support for peaks of workload. So if you have a glut of voids, you're probably going to need to set up a contract or at least a framework with a contractor to help you out with those voids. And then last thing you need to think about is leaseholder consultation. If this is more for planned maintenance and significant maintenance rather than for responsive, because you tend not to charge leaseholders for responsive maintenance. Communal areas are normally within the thresholds that you don't need to consult on. Well, the good news is that an agreement with the DLO is not a qualifying long-term agreement, so you don't have to consult on works with a value of less than £100, but you do have to consult if your DLO is carrying out qualifying works. That's basically any works to construction works, repair works, with an annual value of over £250. And that's £250 that you're charging to any leaseholder or variable service charge payer in a financial year, irrespective of whether they're done under this contract or any other contract. So you'll need to consult leaseholders about those qualifying works. So, tendering contracts within group structures, the TECL test. TECL was way back in the 80s, there was no exemption for contracts within a group structure. So you had the classic situation of a parent organisation had its DLO in a separate company, and you'd have to tender that contract between the parent registered provider and the subsidiary. Then along came the TECL case, and what TECL says was that as long as the control test and the activities test are satisfied, then you don't have to tender contracts between the parent and subsidiary. Effectively, for EU procurement purposes, they're being treated as a single organisation. There's lots of case law on the slide. I think the slides will be available afterwards, so I'm not going to go through that in any detail, other than to tell you what the law is going to be. I said that the new procurement rules came out last week. That's a consultation draft. It has the date 2015 on it, so my guess is they'll come into force either 1st of January or fairly soon afterwards. Under those new rules, the control test will be that the parent, the registered provider, has to control the strategic objectives and significant decisions of the DLO. In other words, the group board approves its business plan for each financial year and stops it doing things which would create risk for the organisation. The activities test, when the new regulations come into force, 80% of the activities must be carried out for the parent organisation. In other words, you can do 20% of business outside your group. And the last one is the capital test, that the DLO is either wholly owned by one registered provider in the group or a number of registered providers in the group. So you've got a clear shareholding link. So, implementation. How do you set up a DLO? Well, in terms of procurement, there is no procurement because either there's no contracts, you can't contract with yourself legally. I used to work for Birmingham City Council, which tried many times to contract with itself and failed. It had service level agreements instead, which had no legally binding force. So you can't sign a contract with yourself. So if your DLO is part of the registered provider, there is no contract. You might have a service level agreement which sets out service standards, but it's not a legal contract. Or you'll make sure that the TECL test is satisfied. You do need to follow the EU procurement rules for significant subcontractors. Most subcontracts will probably have a value below 4.3 million, so you probably won't need to run an ODU process for them. But material supply contracts and things like vans, those are supply or services contracts with a low threshold, 172,000, where you'll have to follow full EU compliance. So your DLO will need to follow the procurement rules for its purchases. You can either set up a DLO or you can buy a DLO. We've acted for a couple of registered providers recently who've bought out their contractors. One was a wholesale buyout of a small electrical contractor. One was the buyout of the part of the business that was delivering this responsive maintenance contract for the client. If you buy a contractor, you need to make sure that you're not paying too much for it. So have a look at things like goodwill valuations. If the goodwill is for your contract, it shouldn't have a value on it. It's only if there are third parties that you're delivering for, and those contracts will definitely continue after the purchase, that you should be paying for goodwill. Make sure you've got some warranties and indemnities, so a warranty that there's no hidden liabilities in the business that you're buying. Where you buy a business, if you don't buy it as a going concern, if there's no transfer of a going concern, you have to pay VAT on the assets transferred. So you need to make sure that it's structured as a transfer of a going concern. On the one where we bought out part of the contractor's business, we got the contractor to put that into a separate company by what's called a hive down, and we then bought that company to make sure that there was a transfer of a going concern. We didn't have to pay VAT on the purchase. Think about what registrations you need. If you're doing gas works, you'll need gas safe registration, both for the people doing the work and for the organisation. Make sure you've factored your lead-in time for that into your programme. And think about things like waste licences, what you need to register with the local authority. I've talked about TUPE. TUPE will generally apply if there's an ongoing service that is being continued. And there was a recent case that said planned maintenance is treated as a service for TUPE purposes, unless there's a significant gap between your programmes. So it will be what's called a service provision change, and employees who are assigned to that service, in other words, spend the majority of their working life working for that client, will transfer under TUPE. I'm going to look briefly at a couple of alternative options that may either facilitate a DLO or be an alternative to a DLO. The first one is to think about, well, if you haven't got the skills and resources to set up a DLO, how might you get a contractor to help you with that? So what we have here is we have a DLO, either in a separate company or within the housing provider, and we have a contract with the contractor to help manage the DLO. So what are the issues with that? Well, the advantages are it might allow you to set up a DLO in circumstances where you couldn't otherwise. You get your VAT savings on the labour. You got some protection from contractor insolvency, because if your contractor helping you manage the DLO goes bust, you get another contractor, and your contractor can help support workload peaks. What are the issues? Well, the big one here is how far is the contractor going to be responsible for the performance of your DLO? What a contractor will say is, if I'm taking all the risk on your DLO's performance, then my reward ought to be similar to the reward that I would get if I were actually carrying out the works themselves. So I ought to be paid the same as if I was delivering the works. And there's some logic to that. The contractor will also say, I need to have sufficient control over the DLO to be able to manage those risks. So I need to be in control of things like hiring and firing, discipline, numbers of staff, those kinds of things. So when you're thinking about payment, you need to balance risk and reward, and also control. You should be thinking about placing risk with the party best able to manage it. Needless to say, KPIs are crucial here. You need to think about how you set and manage the KPIs and measure them. It's much easier to do that if your DLO is in a separate organisation than if your DLO is part of the main registered provider, because you're ring fencing things like finances, performance, etc. A couple of procurement points on that contract with the contractor. The first question is, what are you buying? Are you buying a maintenance contract, or are you buying a professional service? You're buying some management consultancy. It'll depend on how far you're giving the contractor control over your DLO. If you're buying management consultancy services, including the service of running your DLO, the threshold there is 172,000 and a bit. And that's over 4 years. So if you're going to pay your contractor more than 45 grand a year, you need to think about procuring that contract via ODRU. Other models. You've probably heard talk of shared services. Shared services is a local authority term where you have different authorities combining different parts of their service. In registered provider world, the term is a cost sharing group, a VAT cost sharing group. This is a fairly new thing. It only came in 2012. There are some models. Watford and Thrive did one of the early ones. Festival and Rooftop is one that I was involved in personally, where effectively Rooftop are taking all their maintenance services from Festival Housing's DLO. The objective has to be here to reduce overheads through economies of scale. The provider can't be seen to be taking a profit from the arrangements, and therefore if you are the supplier of the services, the organisation with the DLO, your driver here must be economies of scale. So what are the issues? Well, the issues are both sides have to have control over the cost-sharing vehicle. So there needs to be client-side coordination. There's some practicalities around that, like whose work gets done in priorities. So you need to have some protocols around that. The financial cost apportionment is quite complicated. You have to work out the intention of the revenue is that it should be cost reimbursement. So effectively you have a DLO where you have one organisation, two organisations sharing that DLO and sharing the costs of that DLO in proportion, either equally or in proportion to the work that DLO does for them. In practice, it doesn't work like that. You have an organisation with a subsidiary, and you have another organisation wanting to use that subsidiary, and you have to work out a fair apportionment of the costs that satisfies the revenue. The last model I'm going to talk about is the wholly owned subsidiary, or WOS model. You've probably heard of that. It's very similar to the model where the contractor helps you run your DLO, except that this is designed, it was designed by one of our competitors as an equivalent to an external contract. So the contractor has a normal maintenance contract, JCT measured term or NEC term service, TPC, whatever. And that contractor is paid and judged like any other external contractor, except that the workforce is in a wholly owned subsidiary, which is 100% subsidiary of the registered provider. The workforce is wholly managed by the contractor, and the contractor takes the risk in relation to the workforce. There's normally some sharing around pensions risks, but essentially the contractor takes the risk. So the payments to the contractor have deducted from them the payments for the labour costs. You save the VAT on the labour costs, because that's VAT exempt, but obviously the payment to the contractor is much lower, and you have a lower amount that you're paying VAT on. It's a VAT saving device and needs to be seen as a VAT saving device. So procurement. There was a concern when this was first set up, do you actually have two contracts because your wholly owned subsidiary is a commercial organisation? I'm on my last slide and I'm about to finish. So the wholly owned subsidiary, do you have to tender that contract because it's a commercial organisation? Well, the Commission said no, you just have one procurement that sets up both arrangements. You will always use the competitive dialogue procedure for a wholly owned subsidiary procurement because the sharing of risk and the balance of control that the contractor has over the subsidiary needs to be worked out in a negotiated way. The competitive dialogue procedure is like any other tender process using the restricted procedure, except that it's got an extra stage in the middle where you're negotiating the terms of the contract documents with the three bidding teams from 3 tenderers, not 5. there's a new procedure in the new regulations, the competitive negotiated procedure, but essentially it'll be no change. So the key message is, think about the drivers for you. Why are you doing this? Are you just looking to save VAT, or are you trying to manage some of the risks? Is this because this is core business for you? Think of the type of organisation. If you're a local authority or an ALMO, there's no VAT advantages. Think about scale and the level of potential VAT savings. The more complicated the model, the greater the costs in terms of legal and financial and particularly tax advice, and the longer the procurement period. So do the savings justify doing this? Have you got the appetite and have you got the capability to run a DLO? And if not, can you buy it in? And what are the opportunities for shared services? Is there anyone else's DLO that you can use? And think about, finally, what's your objective? Is it primarily VAT saving? Or is it better to look at something like a joint venture or true partnering with a contractor? I've gone slightly over. I will be here around for the questions and until the end of lunchtime if you want to catch me on any specific questions.